Hello, my name is Dr. Jasveer Kaur Mahil, and over the past 5 decades, I've noticed an increasing lack of cohesion between what educators consider to be relevant, useful, and important in formal education and what students believe they need to learn to thrive during the contemporary Fourth Industrial Revolution. I'll reflect on this using my own decades of experience through a British education system as an example. I entered the school system in Stafford, England, as a 6-year-old in the 1960s. And in the photograph on the left, I'm proudly posing for my very first English school photo. My teachers at this primary school, in the photograph on the right, placed me in a remedial class for children with behavioral issues, which was popularly known as the Dunces class, because having recently arrived in England, I was unable to speak English. I was banned from speaking the language that I was fluent in, my mother tongue, Punjabi, even though I'd learned to read and write in Gurmukhi by the time I was 4. The 1960s were times when our family didn't have a telephone, and no one in those days had mobile phones, the internet, or social media platforms for communication. So as a 6-year-old, I was regularly writing letters to cousins I'd left behind in Punjab. In protest against my teachers who refused to acknowledge the wealth of knowledge and skills I brought to the classroom, I refused to speak to anyone at all during school time for well over a whole year. Meanwhile, at home, I was translating the Ladybird series of books on interesting subjects such as Jesus of Nazareth for my mother, who had never attended school and she'd never heard of Jesus. No one taught me the skills of translation, but I learned these because it was important for me to share what I was learning with my mother. At the time, no one in my family knew where Nazareth was, and I noticed that the book is now called Jesus the Helper rather than Jesus of Nazareth, perhaps because being a helper is more relevant to a 6-year-old than trying to locate the importance of Nazareth in their world. It's also interesting how easily we learn what is important to us of our own accord outside the traditional formal classroom. We learn to cook through observation in our own homes. We learn to communicate articulately through practice with our family and friends. And we learn to share, tolerate, and collaborate by serving in our communities. Unfortunately, in my case, as a 6-year-old, my prior learning, including my letter writing skills, my translation skills, and my courage in adapting to a cold, hostile, and unfamiliar environment were deemed to be irrelevant. And I was seen by my teachers to be simply an empty vessel to be filled with knowledge according to my capacity. This was an acceptable model of education in those days. The teacher was expected to transmit knowledge like a radio, and students were expected to receive the information, absorb it, and digest it. Education, which was meant to serve the first 2 industrial revolutions, was designed to mold children into compliant, efficient, and productive adults that would increase the wealth of the nation, with the promise of a job for life and a much higher standard of life with qualifications than without them. The Fourth Industrial Revolution has disrupted this model to a large extent. The teacher is no longer the only expert in the room. Accessibility to the internet means that each student is able to access knowledge from multiple sources at their own convenience, not relying solely on the teacher. Moreover, the importance of informal education, which takes place beyond the realms of traditional classrooms, in our homes, in our communities, and in our places of work, is at last being acknowledged. The pandemic lockdowns have served to demonstrate how quickly, easily, and effectively we can adapt and learn using our own devices, our own initiative, and our own choices. We have increasing freedom to learn what we want, when we want, and how we want to learn, whether it's through immersion, observation, or trial and error. Through the fourth industrial revolution, there will be a greater appreciation of learning that takes place through coaching, mentoring, supervision, professional discussions, networking, or simply through being within our own families, our friends, and our communities. Whereas the first and second industrial revolutions encouraged us to think of education as a means for gaining long-term employment and acquiring a standard of living through material wealth, the fourth industrial revolution, in contrast, allows us to move towards a values and skills-based education, focusing on fulfillment in all aspects of our lives, including our spiritual, social, and our emotional well-being. As educators, using a systems thinking paradigm for our curriculum design, we can avoid the pitfalls of the type of education that I received, where relevance, usefulness, and importance were seen through a very narrow perspective, which failed to account for the contextual complexities experienced by myself and other learners with the wealth of knowledge that we had already acquired using our own learning strategies, even when we arrived at primary school, and obviously by the time we arrived at higher education. Education that is designed for the fourth industrial revolution needs to be fit for purpose to meet the personal rather than the standardized aspirations of the diverse range of students that we serve at both the local and also the global level. Contemporary education needs to acknowledge our global interconnectedness and our diverse histories that shape our identities, our values, and our lifestyles. Synthesis of our prior learning, emergence of new knowledge, and preparation for lifelong learning, which is expected to continue beyond completion of the course, will prepare our students for futures that we cannot possibly predict. Based on the trends that I have noticed over the past 50 years in education, the underlying pillars of curriculum design will now emphasize the role of co-creation of knowledge that is relevant, useful, and transferable across contexts, in sharp contrast to the model of education that relies on the teacher being the sole expert in class. We will instead build bridges between life worlds so that synthesis of knowledge from different realms can enhance the life experiences of all concerned. Instead of competing with robots and artificial intelligence through the fourth industrial revolution, these robots and these artificial intelligences can easily provide us with knowledge that is standardized, impersonal, and mundane. But teachers are more likely to be useful in coaching for skills development, for example, communication skills, leadership skills, vocational skills. Collaborative partnerships and projects requiring knowledge and skills from a broad range of subjects and disciplines are more likely to benefit the sustainability, the growth, and the cybersecurity priorities, which will be prevalent in the fourth industrial revolution. This may reduce the high levels of specialism, which often come at the expense of broader contextual awareness. As educators, even though we have well-intentioned aims and objectives, we're often unaware of what we are really teaching our students. We do not accurately foresee what they will remember about their time with us 50 years down the line. We don't know how dramatically the world will have changed by then. My teachers in the 1960s were guided by the agenda of the first industrial revolution, and they saw me as an empty vessel which they tried to pour knowledge into. From my position as an educator at a university now, reflecting on the deepest lesson I learned from my first year at primary school, I believe that my teachers were probably misguided, to say the least. They were misguided to see their students as empty vessels, as though they had survived until then without learning, without adapting, and without growing as conscious human beings. Perhaps in the 60s, they were also wrong to believe that teachers are always experts. We may be experts in some contexts, but we may be facilitators in others. And an increasingly important role of educators in the fourth industrial revolution is to be catalysts, stimulating learning, inspiring enthusiasm, and igniting the flames of creative expression. Simple questions can often serve as catalysts for creative learning. For example, what do you know already? This can explore the platform of existing knowledge, and I wish my teachers in the 1960s had asked me that question. What else do you need to know? We need to find out what is relevant, useful, and appropriate for the student. And another question, how will this transform your life? We need to make sure that it's the student aspiration that will be fulfilled through the time and effort that they invest in learning.